Hey y'all, Moses here. In the last few months, PUBG has hit what many consider to be a low point in its life cycle. There are vocal sections of both current and former players ranging from the average YouTube troll to highly successful pro players and streamers who are genuinely concerned for PUBG's future. Essentially, all these voices fall into one of two camps: those who want to see PUBG fail, and those who want it to change its course and regain some of its former glory as the most popular battle royale game in the world. This video will cover some of PUBG's problems and try to determine what might be helpful for PUBG to change course. Before we get started, I want to plainly state my opinion, because there are frequent comments about my personal bias in these videos. I love PUBG. It changed my life. I have formed a streaming and YouTube career out of my love for PUBG, and have been lucky enough to travel the world covering the esports side of the game. PUBG is very important to me, but I'm not blind to its issues. Those issues and my love for the game are what inspired me to make this video. So without further ado, let's get started. Check out the PC37X gaming headset from Massdrop. The PC37X was a custom gaming headset designed with comfort and performance in mind. The plush ear cups and headband, in combination with a crystal clear noise-canceling microphone, makes marathon gaming sessions a breeze. Check out the link in the description below and get instant shipping from Massdrop today. I believe that PUBG is suffering from an identity crisis, which perhaps has made it difficult for the development team to prioritize game changes and fixes. Our understanding of how PUBG makes decisions is limited due to the general lack of real communication regarding operational priorities. The Fix PUBG campaign was the first specific project designed to soothe the population, but after the launch of Fix PUBG and its accompanying website, we haven't heard much aside from patch notes addressing some of the points inside the campaign. Obviously, the dev team giving us a roadmap and then implementing those changes was kind of the idea, but many of the Fix PUBG patches introduced new and sometimes severe issues. This has diminished the overall effectiveness and good intentions of the campaign. So, back to the identity crisis, which I've broken down into three parts. 1. Is PUBG a survival game or a shooter game? 2. Third-person versus first-person perspectives. And 3. Maps and modes. The first question, I believe, is the most controversial. PUBG is a complex and open game, so perhaps calling it either a survival or shooter game is a bit harder considering all the different factors in how you can achieve success. I put out a poll on Twitter, and it appears that even in a relatively limited response pool, there is a division among players. Of those that responded, the majority of players feel that PUBG is at its core a shooter game, but about 40% of respondents feel it's a survival game. I'll recognize my bias here once again because I feel that PUBG is a shooter game with survival elements, but those survival elements are much less important than the shooting aspect. PUBG is blessed with one of the most satisfying and well-rounded shooting systems in any game ever. This is a tremendous and difficult achievement. Many popular streamers share this sentiment, but if there is one endorsement that stands out above all else, it's this one.
Where do I think PUBG shooting mechanics and systems rank? I mean, it depends. It depends. Like, if you're talking shooting mechanics in a BR, I think it has one of the best, if not the best, shooting mechanics in a BR. Its shooting mechanics are definitely up there. It has some of the best shooting mechanics I've ever played in a BR game. It reminds me a lot of like Counter-Strike with ADS. You know, it's very, very similar in that regard. The recoil feels really, really good.
PUBG has been out for nearly 2 years, and I think it's time that the developers decide what they want the future to look like. If I had my way, it would be that the devs rely on the strength that made PUBG what it is: a tactical BR shooter with survival elements. So that boils down to the burning question and the core of this video. How can PUBG improve the quality of life for most players that feel the game is more shooter than survival game, without ostracizing the large amount of players that disagree? Now enters the second factor of PUBG's identity crisis, which is an argument that has long raged: third-person versus first-person perspective. PUBG launched with one map and one mode. Everyone was playing the same game, and from the low reaches of the total noob all the way up to the fledgling pro scene, TPP on Erangel was all we knew. Then in August of 2017, first-person perspective launched and changed everything. This was the first time the queue divided. Now players could choose between modes, and things started to shift. FPP was considered by its patrons as more competitively fair, but that too was debated. Over time, FPP has carved out its stake, and in the West, FPP is the choice of competitively minded players. This has led to another lingering question. How do you balance a game and prioritize fixes when first person and third person are vastly different in how they're played? I'm not going to enter conjecture on the popular opinions of why TPP and FPP are different, because that discussion is often filled with undue vitriol and trading insults. But I wanted to grab onto something empirical that could help me support a hypothesis that first-person perspective players are more interested in shooter elements of the game than the survival elements. First, let's take a look at the hard data, courtesy of PUBGmap.io, which pulls its data from the PUBG API. Across the globe, third-person perspective accounts for 81.5% of matches, with the most popular game mode being TPP squads. Broken down by region, Europe is the only region where FPP accounts for a majority, albeit a slight one, with 51.3% of matches being played in first-person perspective. Asia is a completely different story, where 96.6% of matches are played in third person. This might not seem like a surprise to you, but the kicker here is that Asia accounts for nearly 50% of the total player base of PUBG. And to round out the stats barrage, North America might come as a surprise. Only 28% of matches are played in first-person perspective. So how do these two first parts interact? Where does the TPP and FPP argument and shooter versus survival arguments intersect? The answer is in the maps. All three of PUBG's maps are different, but Sanhok stands alone as an interesting experiment and shows us some important information on how FPP and TPP mentalities and playstyles diverge. Sanhok being much smaller than Erangel and Miramar, as well as its faster circles, lead to a fast-paced, shooter-focused game. Survival elements take a backseat to action. Looking at the data, this seems to be a turnoff for the TPP enthusiast. On average, 63% of first-person perspective games across all modes are played on Sanhok. Erangel comes in at a slight lead for second place at just under 20%, and Miramar trails at 17%. This is in stark contrast to the stats for the third-person perspective, where Sanhok accounts for 49% of games, with Erangel and Miramar splitting the remainder nearly evenly, with Erangel getting the slight lead at 25.6%. A quick disclaimer on these numbers. Sanhok games run about 10 minutes shorter than both Erangel and Miramar, which will mean more games and a potentially inflated percentage. The unknown variable here is player choice driving map selection. For me, this was a bit of a breakthrough. My interpretation is that first-person perspective players prefer a faster, action-oriented game, where third-person perspective players prefer a slower-paced game, and perhaps this is why the survival and shooter argument was as split as it was. I'd like to state here that both styles deserve respect. It's nobody's fault that the player base was divided in this way. PUBG added FPP because they listened to their players during an explosive growth period. And everything was fine because the player pool was so large that everyone could play whatever they wanted and enjoy relatively fast queue times. Sadly, that's no longer the case. By the time Sanhok had released, PUBG's peak player count had dropped from its all-time high of just over 3 million to about 1.5 million. Regions like Oceania had started to become affected by the now massive amount of queue options. 3 maps, 2 perspectives, and 3 game modes. And games like Fortnite had eroded the player base in North America substantially. This trend has continued, with the peak daily user count idling under 1 million players, the lowest since July of 2017. Many will point to this stat as an indicator that PUBG is rapidly dying. But if you take a moment to consider that PUBG was the first game to popularize Battle Royale, and by word of mouth attracted a massive audience. Squads being the most popular global game mode explains this to an extent. One person joined and then brought their friends along with them. I'm sure many of you have played games with friends and colleagues, only to have them flake out and move on not too long after. I believe this is the case with PUBG, plus the continued stability and performance issues eventually frustrating players to the point that they just decided to move on. The player count began to decline right after its peak in January, and now appears to have stabilized at 850,000 peak users per day, still leaving PUBG as the most played game on Steam. At this stage, it's time to move past the discussion of PUBG's decline in player base and focus on what matters. There is still a huge population across the world that plays PUBG every single day, and there's a good chance that you're one of those people. So now I'm going to go over one of my ideas on how to improve the game. Again, a quick disclaimer, there's a good chance that I'm not the first person to come up with this idea, so if I trip over someone else's original thoughts, please accept my apologies. The first thing I'd like to do is acknowledge PUBG's endeavor to create a functional esports ecosystem, because I'm very involved with that growing segment of players, and PUBG's Pro League is right around the corner. PUBG's esports community spent a large amount of time testing settings and circle variables to find the optimal flow for a game in first-person perspective. To summarize a somewhat boring topic, PUBG esports are played on Erangel and Miramar, and features somewhat faster early circles, smaller mid-game circles, and slower late-game circles, which allows easier movement and fighting in the endgame. They also feature increased loot spawns for key gear such as assault rifles, DMRs, and snipers. The red zone has also been disabled. My proposal is this: split the queues into two modes, one labeled competitive and the other regular. The competitive game mode would enforce first-person perspective and rejoin Erangel and Miramar into a single queue with the competitive settings I mentioned applied to both maps. Sanhok would also be a part of this competitive queue but would not have any settings adjusted. The circle settings would alleviate the sometimes slow pace of Erangel and Miramar, as well as address a popular complaint that the looting phase is much too long and inconsistent. This change would also bring the regular player base closer to the esports community and potentially increase general interest in PUBG esports. The regular game mode or third-person perspective could be called many things, but would remain essentially untouched. I don't believe that third-person perspective players should receive a casual title, and that the style of play of TPP should be preserved or adjusted independently of the proposed competitive game mode. This change would bring the added benefits of a reduced wait time by reducing the total amount of queues, and would support the more shooter tactical-minded players without affecting the very important major market of Asia and the global population who prefers third-person perspective. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that you found it interesting, or that at least you learned something new. If you liked the video, leave a like, and if you have any feedback or ideas of your own, leave a comment down below as well. Don't forget to check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/wtfmoses, and to enter this month's giveaway linked in the description down below. I hope to be able to cover some other topics I've been thinking about now that I have some time, so I look forward to bringing you guys more content and streams over the coming months. That's it for this one, guys, and as always, I'll see you out there.